Please welcome John Mattison.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. I went through and I sort of categorized what I see as the imperatives that we need to take out of this experience and how to really embed them deeply in the future of virtual care, digital health care, decision support, analytics, machine learning, and simplifying the experience for both providers and for patients in ways that are much more accessible to an entire population. So I'm going to go through what I see as the 7 imperatives. But first, I think you already mentioned that necessity is the mother of invention. And what's happened in digital healthcare prior to COVID is that there's been a steady pace of discovery and innovation and deployment. And COVID obviously was a huge catalytic event. And so historically, the time between a novel discovery in medicine and widespread implementation has been well characterized as taking, on average, 17 years. And we've seen that compressed into shorter and shorter windows given our access to electronic health records and clinical decision supports. But what COVID has really forced upon us is an international research and development community and collaboration, very much in an open source model that has accelerated the early sharing of research. And as one example, there were over 40,000 papers published on COVID in a 6-month period, the first 6 months of COVID, and that continues today. Another example, most of you have probably read about what DeepMind did in the biannual contest to model folding in proteins. So the contestants are given a string of amino acids and told, tell us what this looks like in a 3-dimensional conformation of the protein, which has huge implications for the advance of understanding of both human physiology and immunology, as well as therapeutics. And what DeepMind has done is they won the last contest 2 years ago, with a modest margin. This year, they blew every competitor out of the water. And one of the researchers in the space of protein folding said that what DeepMind did in a matter of minutes was the subject of 10 years of research in their lab. And so we're seeing, again, this compression of transformational time from basic science to clinically relevant medicine to translation into therapy. And that's pervasive across the entire waterfront. So I'm going to go into these 7 imperatives and give a few examples for each of the imperatives that we should both learn from the COVID experience as well as amplify in all of our work going forward. So COVID itself, I am now Emeritus at Kaiser Permanente, but in January, when I was still there, we were seeing 50,000 virtual visits a month. Within 6 months, we were up to 50,000 per day. It's just an example of a 30-fold scaling of something that was fairly well advanced already. The clinical trials in the US and globally really suffered huge setbacks in the first couple of months of COVID, but the research teams and the pharmaceutical companies doing pharmaceutical research quickly discovered that they could use wearables and virtual visits and resume clinical trials. And so the clinical trial resumption has been extraordinary in the midst of this crisis, using off-the-shelf technology that had not been really deployed at scale previously. Another thing is how we personalize. There's such a buzz around personalized medicine, and it's legitimate. And how do we do that with vaccines? So now that we have these different vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, and Sinovac, and others, how do we understand which vaccine is most appropriate for which individuals based upon both the risk of the individual, the efficacy of the vaccine, and the potential for side effects, and we're just beginning to learn. So many of you may have heard this morning that two healthcare workers in the UK, among the first recipients of the Pfizer vaccine, had significant allergic reactions. And what wasn't known previously to the general public is that people with a history of significant allergic reactions were excluded from the clinical trials of the vaccine. But now that they're going to full deployment, they open it up to anyone and everyone. And the upshot of that is we've learned that there is a significant risk of allergic reactions, and they're excluding people now for the scaled deployment of the vaccine if they've had a previous experience of severe allergic reactions. We need to know how long these vaccines last. We need to know who needs to be revaccinated at what interval and how to detect that. And so there's just an enormous amount of science coming out with respect to that. And never in the history of medicine have we had personalized vaccine guidelines. And we're on the cusp of that, and we will see that, I'm sure, within a couple of years as an outgrowth of some of the basic science done during this COVID pandemic. Early detection of the virus. So there are some very fascinating studies showing, in addition to doing home diagnostics using the various test kits, which hasn't been scaled yet, but things like UDO-Test are providing end-to-end workflows for providing home test kits with rapid turnaround time and reporting. But in addition to that, there's some fascinating research being done looking at volatile organic compounds in our breath, so that you measure someone's breath, look at specific chemicals to see if there's a pattern that suggests a COVID infection early on. A very relatively simple test. And they have been able to train dogs to be able to differentiate a COVID infected patient from people with other virus infections, which is very promising that we can replicate that with machines soon. And so the third thing I want to mention is around restoring mental health. So we know that there's a mental health epidemic that is following the pandemic from all of the social isolation, particularly in young children who haven't been socialized and going to school. And so the virtual care apps associated with behavioral health support and virtual visits are exploding, really scaling well. And the very first telemedicine project I was involved with, it was over 25 years ago, and indeed was telepsychiatry. So it's probably the most amenable to a virtual kind of relationship and communication channel. But in addition, many of you may have heard of the app recently that's been developed that people who have PTSD frequently have perseverative, anxiety-provoking dreams. And there's now some algorithms that have been shown to detect those dreams and to gently stimulate someone out of a dream, disrupt their dream without waking them up, and seeing improvement in their scores around anxiety and PTSD during the day. In addition, we have the whole challenge of how do we restore the economy and how do we restore international travel? And I've been waiting for someone to bring to market a particular application that was just announced in Australia just in the past week or so. And that is a digital health passport. So currently, if you want to travel to New Zealand or Australia and you land, you need to be quarantined for 14 days before you can go out. And that's true of many countries. And that's not exactly an efficient way for either vacationers or for business travel. And so this digital health passport is intended to look at what your vaccine status is, what your diagnostic testing status is, and is intended to overcome the need for a prolonged period of isolation prior to engaging in your new destination. In addition, what I think the basic science coming out of COVID is going to reveal is how to assess the persistence of immunity. So we know that in COVID, antibodies are really not very sensitive. So a lot of the people who are asymptomatic with COVID, but infectious to other people, have undetectable antibodies shortly after the infection. And those who do mount a good antibody response, there's a pretty rapid decline in the antibodies so that we can see that the antibody test is not very sensitive in order to determine exposure or immunity. And so a lot of research has been done in a number of labs around the world, particularly at the La Jolla Institute of Immunology, where they've published a whole series of landmark papers that are demonstrating how careful assessment of our two major types of immune cells, T cells and B cells, tells a story that you don't see in the antibodies. So how are we going to take that kind of information and deploy that at scale so we can say, sure, you were vaccinated for COVID in January of 2021, but it's now January of 2022, and we want to make sure that you're still immune. How do we do that inexpensively, quickly, cheaply, and incorporate that in something like a digital health passport? And then finally, the contact tracing apps and so forth. Those are incredibly valuable in a country like New Zealand or Australia, where the incidence of COVID has been managed so effectively and is so low, where that can actually work. In the US, quite frankly, the horses are out of the barn. The prevalence rate is so high that contact tracing is a bit of a fool's errand right now. Once we get the numbers down, it will become critical to keep the numbers down. But right now, it's a bit of a problem. So in addition to the primary research about T cells and B cells and antibodies and how to test, we know that in addition to antibody testing have a low sensitivity, we know that antigen testing, which is being promoted pretty aggressively right now, also has very low sensitivity in the first 4 to 5 days of infection when people are already infectious and contagious to others. So there's problems with sensitivity in that. And we know that in PCR testing, there's a specificity problem in that you can still detect fragments of the virus very readily long after the acute disease is over and long after the person is no longer infectious, because it detects fragments. But we do not yet have good data corresponding to each of the different commercial assays using PCR for COVID to know at what threshold of cycles of PCR that it means that they're just fragments and no longer viable virus. So that's on the horizon. So that's some of the lessons out of COVID itself. The second imperative is how are we going to manage the health of our populations now that we're moving into a year when resources have been stretched thin, the economy's been hammered, and we still have a raging pandemic. And so how do we execute at scale with a triple aim of improving quality, cost, and access, and deal with burnt out providers and deal with health equity? So what's been described as a triple aim, I like to think is a quintuple aim that adds in both the addressing the burnout of physicians and addressing health equity. And that's playing out as we speak, as different countries begin to announce their strategies for sequencing, who gets a limited supply of vaccines first and in what sequence. So an area that's still subject to active debate. The third imperative is how we really look at person centricity. I like to say patient-centric is an oxymoron because patients are what doctors call people that have much larger lives than their role as a patient. And so I like to think of person centricity and published a paper with that title. And what we need to know about the individual is what are their nomograms? What's normal for them? They're members of my family who have a normal temperature, baseline temperature of 97, 97.2. So when they're at 98.3, that's a fever to them. And that's true on both ends of the spectrum. 98.6 is an average. And so how do we take that kind of information about an individual and establish different trigger points, thresholds, boundaries, guardrails, escalations, and alerts based upon the individual? And it's not just around temperature. We need to do that around all the parameters that we're measuring with various wearables and home diagnostics. And in addition to that, we need to address the social determinants of health much more comprehensively. Imperative number 4 is addressing root causes of disease. So what are some of the risk factors for COVID? Well, being male and advanced age are 2, but The other factors are really disorders of lifestyle, hypertension, coronary disease, diabetes, and obesity. Those are disorders of lifestyle. So how do we double down on our efforts to address what Dan Buettner brilliantly illustrated in his book Blue Zones about how we eat, sleep, exercise, and socialize are critical. And how do we motivate people? Because that's not a technical problem. That's a behavioral problem. And so how do we use modern technology to restore the ancient wisdom embedded in every Aboriginal tribe about healthy eating, sleeping, exercise, and socialization? And then how do we establish a motivational fingerprint and a motivational formulary that it can be customized to the individual so that we message them, communicate with them, intervene in ways that correspond with their personal motivational profile? How do we quickly assess what their basic profile is? How do we learn over time what they respond best to, and then alter our interventions through digital technologies to maximize their trajectory towards a healthier state, particularly in these disorders of lifestyle that put them at much higher risk of getting COVID, and if they do get it, having a more adverse outcome. And then the fifth one is the patient experience itself. How do we integrate all the services in ways that patients feel that all the technology is supporting them and not just generating a stream of data for a research company or for their clinician, but how do we make it usable to them? And how do we use visualization tools to show them this is where you were, this is where you're going, this is how much better you'd be off if you did the following things, and how do we motivate you towards those things? The sixth imperative is around the clinician experience. And I think it's pretty well known in the provider community that burnout is a huge problem, particularly in primary care physicians. Over 50% of the physicians globally in primary care have given evidence of their having emotional distress with their practices and burnout. And that's only gone up with COVID. The stress levels are just extraordinarily high. So how do we simplify their lives, and how do we support clinicians better? So one of the first things is to use machine learning to help pull the signals out of the noise, put it back in the context of the noise for that individual, but look at better ways of identifying what is actionable and how to create a one-click link between a set of data seen in visualization tools by the clinician and an appropriate action, making the right thing to do the easiest thing to do through visualization tools and a user interface that doesn't require 17 clicks to get from here to there. So ultimately, what we're looking at is a mashup of everything we know about an individual, the so-called N of one, and the universe of clinical knowledge. And how do we put that into the context of the virtuous cycle of evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence? How do we incorporate the experience of every single patient with every single encounter into a large body of data that can be mined using machine learning to expand the knowledge about humans in general and health in general, as well as what's relevant to that particular issue? The big conundrum there is, how do we provide enough privacy to anonymize individuals such that their data can be used as a substrate for advancing the knowledge and science of healthcare without violating their privacy? And that's been a very elusive goal, but it turns out that the same technology underlying Bitcoin, that being blockchain or distributed ledger technology, in combination with some other emerging technologies that are just beginning to mature, like homomorphic encryption, the subject of a great deal of research in Microsoft and IBM and others, so that we can actually put data into a database that is accessible for research without anybody ever being able to identify who an individual is. So I think it's important to recognize that de-identification is a mythical beast. In the world of machine learning, you cannot de-identify somebody. You can make efforts to prevent re-identification, which is what distributed ledger technology and homomorphic encryption can bring to the table. But this notion you pull out the date of birth and the zip code and the employer, and suddenly you de-identified someone, it's been provably nonsense for quite some time. So Once we get to this view of how we can use individual people's data without exposing them to the risk of being re-identified and embarrassed in any way, we will have an opportunity to be able to recruit from operational data, real world evidence, people who are good candidates for various clinical trials, reduce the cost of recruiting people into clinical trials, reduce the cost of managing them, and harvest much more value at scale from many more participants in both observational studies of real world evidences that'll suggest good studies to do in the future, as well as prospective trials. So I like to think of where we're headed is an accordion model of learning. And by accordion, I mean you open up the accordion and you look at all the possible therapeutic interventions relevant to an individual in a particular clinical context. And then you narrow that back down to just one or two. You can test them in prospective trials at scale using real world evidence, electronic health record data, managed prospectively. And then when there's new science, new diagnostics, new sensors, new wearables, you open the accordion back up and say, well, let's look at everything once again and see what has changed now that we have new information, new clinical practice guidelines, new algorithms coming out of our machine learning based upon the prior information. And you close the accordion back down and say, these are the two best therapies that emerge out of that open accordion, narrow it down in a prospective trial and see which one is superior, and then go through a cycle of opening and closing over time with that. So we're at the cusp of very, very accelerated rate of discovery and translation into clinical practice. So I'll stop there and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. John, many thanks for that. So much to dig into. There's plenty I could talk about, but I am going to go to some questions straight away just to give people an opportunity. I think first up, we've got Darius from Globant. Hi there, Darius.
Thank you. Hey, John, thanks for your insights and especially of the recap of these 7 imperatives. Very, very interesting. Clearly, the pandemic has accelerated, as you pointed out, right? The adoption of telehealth, digital remote monitoring, and other health IT trends. If you had to make a couple of bold predictions for, say, 2021 and 2022, as it relates to the application of AI and wearable devices, and even in general patient experience, what would you say would be the 2 biggest bold predictions that you see, accelerate multifold?
Great question, Darius. I would pull out 2 actually. One is the much better deployment of visualization tools for both the individual person as well as for the care team, so that extraction of signal from noise becomes much more apparent. Our brains are so visually focused that you can show a tremendous amount of information through visualization tools that is just not accessible in a traditional electronic health record. It's just too much work to see that information in the context of all the noise. So the first would be visualization tools. And the second one I would say will be, we're going to start seeing some solutions for privacy that will allow us to enter data into a research infrastructure without taking the kind of risks that we do today around exposing the identity of a particular individual through re-identification technologies. So the ability there, the thing is that if you look at some of the active research around the combination of distributed ledger technology and homomorphic encryption, they can be deployed in a quantum-proof quantum hacking-proof model. So I think we're going to begin to see a higher level of safety for essentially open sourcing large quantities of data, much better global collaboration, without putting the patient at risk of re-identification. And then on the visualization side, getting much better capacity to look at large sets of data and make appropriate decisions quickly and lower the stress on the care delivery team and raise the confidence of the individual patient that they're getting the best care possible.
Great stuff. Thanks, John. Thanks for the question, Darius. Great question. I think we've got, up next, we've got Alfred from Health Tech Insider. Hi there, Alfred. Alfred?
There we go.
There we go. Here he is. Hey, Alfred.
Good morning. John, thank you so much for some very stimulating suggestions. I'm of an age where I remember that my passport had a folded yellow card with all my immunizations on it. And so the concept of a digital health passport makes a lot of sense to me. Do you see it becoming a digital health ID, something that travels with you, not just, abroad, but, within your daily life? And if so, do you have a vision of how that might be implemented? I mean, are we going to be carrying around a USB stick in our wallets, or how do we make this information readily available?
Great question, Alvin. And so there are a multitude of ways that can be done. But what the Australians have done is use a QR code, and you just pull up your cell phone, pull up your passport. There's a QR code. Anybody can search and validate that indeed that is you, and that your passport, your health passport, is up to date. So that would be, a digital mechanism. It's interesting in the context of a very active discussion right now about, is it legal for an employer to say, you may not come to work if you've not been vaccinated? And there's been a number of very experienced legal minds who have taken on that problem in the past couple of weeks, because it's very relevant right now with the vaccine rollout imminent. And the answer to the question from most legal scholars is yes, under the right circumstances, you can actually require that. Imagine a cruise ship. Imagine a sporting event. Imagine a movie theater. If everyone just had to show their QR code and could prove that they were up to date with their immunizations and not actively infected by a variety of means, that could be a very, very streamlined process that could make travel and congregate events like sports events and theater and so forth much safer, much more quickly. But you're correct to identify the need to be able to validate that very quickly and efficiently, and that's where basically an online verification process is going to be essential. And that's what the Australian product is intended to do.
If I could follow up, I know you were talking about blockchain and other security kinds of approaches. What would be the repository for this information? Would it be distributed? Would some central agency be responsible for making sure that, my latest COVID test, positive or negative, actually made it into my record? How might that work?
Another great question. And the answer is that you can federate this data. What's unclear, so the Aussies are the first that I know of to produce a national proposal for such deployment of an application. But obviously, if somebody's traveling to Australia from China, Singapore, US, UK, they need to have access to the same database in order for them to be eligible to skip the quarantine period when they land in Australia. And so my suspicion is we're going to see a proliferation of these nation state tools. And I've been very deeply involved in standards development. I'm the founder of the XML standard, known as the CDA and CCD, used for interoperability in the US. And I've had a lot of experience with many different standards. And what generally happens is there isn't an effective mechanism of converging multiple different standards into a single universal standard until after the problem is really out in production. So I suspect when we see 3 or 4 more countries saying they've solved the problem that the Aussies are the first to publish that I'm aware of, that there will be an international consortium that looks at those. And I suspect HL7 will probably play a central role in reconciling. And so the interoperability of these data points is really not a big challenge, to be quite honest. It's not a large data set. Like a health record is an incredibly large data set, but a health passport need not be that complicated, need not have that many elements, need not to have that much complexity about values within. And so I think the standardization process would be fairly simple. But what we need to do is have interoperability of these, because it's unlikely that a single one will dominate anytime soon. Even though there's only one on the market now, my prediction is by the end of next year, there'll be 10 at least. And then the efforts to standardize for interoperability and universality so that it can be used to travel between any 2 points or enter a congregate event in any country or a cruise ship from any port will be a clear imperative for the standards community. And HL7 has done a magnificent job at managing those kinds of tensions in the past. And I suspect they will have if they don't already, they will have a work group on this topic soon.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great stuff. Many thanks for the questions, Alfred. And many thanks for sharing your thoughts, John. Sadly, that is all we've got time for, which is a real shame, because I feel we could talk about many of these topics for hours to come yet. I love these kind of future casting type sessions. Expect to see many of these topics cropping up in the agenda for next year's summit, I am sure. John, many thanks for providing your insights. It's been great having you here, and certainly plenty of food for thought as we send people away from the summit.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure.
Great to see you.
Stay safe. Wear your mask, social distance. It works.
There you go. Thanks very much, John. Take care.